Good morning. I chose the subject of the Bible because it's a book that we often have very ambivalent feelings towards. So we're all washing our hands quite a lot these days. And going back 6 months ago, things would have been very different. But for the Orthodox Jew, the ritual of hand washing begins with wakening in the morning. When the day begins, one gets up from bed and immediately washes one's hands. In 1386, there was a pandemic in Ferrara, Italy, and it was discovered that the Jews were faring much better. They found that the Jews washed their hands while saying prayers before dinner, and all who became ill were self-quarantined. These practices are part of the holiness codes of ritual purity in the book of Leviticus. Jews also wash their hands after getting their hair cut. And if you go into a Jewish barber, you'll see a sink there with a glass for washing. It's a simple ritual of pouring water over one hand and then over the other. They also wash their hands before and after eating and praying. Now, one might ask, why would you wash your hands after eating? It is said by the Orthodox Jew that when one finishes eating, upon one's hands is sodomite salt. Salt, a word that pertains to taste, and Sodom is the city destroyed in the book of Genesis for their sins. The Talmud states that the sins of Sodom were their custom of what is mine, what is yours. This led to a selfish society that did not care for the stranger, did not care for the poor, the widowed, or the orphan, indeed did not care at all for those who needed help, the care of which is the basis of the Hebrew Bible. It is this care that creates a just and holy society. Care for your neighbor and care for the foreigner dwelling in your land are fundamental. Washing their hands is a reminder to be thankful for the meal that one has eaten, a meal that many others are not afforded. This is especially the case when there is bread in the meal, because bread is a food that takes time and energy to procure. One must yet remember that no matter how much effort one places into the creation of the meal, it is still grace that one is granted the opportunity of eating. The Protestant Reformation initiated the value of the individual's right to interpret the Bible. But is this act of individual interpretation of a religious text by somebody outside of the religion misappropriation? For I have found that I get the deepest understanding of the Hebrew Bible by listening to rabbis. This individualism is at the heart of America, this rugged pioneer individualism. And it was a problem for Ralph Waldo Emerson, who criticized community for its oppressiveness and self-reliance, saying, quote, "Society everywhere is in a conspiracy after the manhood of every one of its members," end quote. And also stating that, quote, "We acquiesce our liberty for the bread of all," end quote. Thus, he incited readers to live out their unique, authentic life. Now, a feminist reading today would cite the patriarchal privilege of Emerson's concern. But Emerson also realized that one cannot make community of individualists. And the COVID crisis has revealed how the construct of social cohesion is perhaps more relevant than individual liberty, as we hear the shrieks of those who have become unhinged when their privilege is challenged, those who are demanding their right not to wear a mask, their right not to engage in socially responsible behavior that could save a life. We have come to realize the importance of this interconnectivity that our tradition has come to acknowledge, and that is at the heart of the Hebrew Bible. As Emerson counseled, we must view religion and the Bible through the eyes of the highest moral and ethical actions. Those actions proclaim life's interconnectivity, life's community. We're living in a world of absurdities, and each day waking to a new level of the inane. The insanity bleeds from computers, television, and even radio, if one yet listens to the radio. I think we need to acknowledge that to move forward, because we are perpetually assaulted by nonsense. The later prophets are an interesting place to start because they also looked out on a world that made no sense to them. It was a world in decay and corruption, a world where all their promises, their visions, the hopes and dreams of the Jewish people were dying. In the book of Isaiah 10:15, the prophet asks, "Does the axe raise itself above the person who swings it, or the saw boast against one who uses it? As if a rod were to wield the person who lifts it, or a club brandish the one who is not wood?" The prophet Isaiah admonishes the king of Assyria for bragging about destroying Israel by claiming that the power the king holds in his victory over Israel is not of his own volition, but is held through the force of God's judgment. The Assyrian king is being used as the axe of Yahweh to cut down Israel for her misdeeds. These misdeeds were making unjust laws, issuing oppressive decrees, denying the poor their rights, withholding justice to the oppressed, from the oppressed, and making widows and orphans their prey. In these days of Israel, the poor were straddled with debt that would lead them into indentured servitude to their debtors. The kings waged war to increase their wealth and viewed themselves as gods. They neglected the needs of the people. Indeed, there is nothing new under the sun. To take Isaiah's question, what does it mean to raise an axe? We can ask, what does it mean for someone to raise the Bible as that axe? What does it mean for someone maybe who has not read it or studied it, nor practiced nor lived it, nor struggled with the Bible? And the Bible is a book that requires intense struggle. What does it mean to raise a book as a means of authoritative power? The problem with raising a Bible when one has no sensitivity or awareness of what it is that it is not a neutral document. It is a weapon of truth and justice, or a weapon of contempt and derision. It can be used as a tool of freedom or a tool of oppression. It can be used as a weapon of truth, a weapon of knowledge, or used as a weapon against an individual or a community. And actually, one of the ironies of that is that the Bible has been used against some of the same people that it has been liberated, and they have come back to use the Bible against other peoples. The first thing we need to ask is, do we need the Bible to be an authority? Do we need authority at all? Of course, as Unitarian Universalists, we do not see it as such, which makes things difficult because it's easier to get together for a General Assembly and ask, what are we going to do? And answer that question with, convert more souls to for Jesus. It's much harder to answer that we're going to dismantle white supremacy and commit ourselves to righting the wrongs of history. But I think that is what Jesus would do. And we need to wrestle with sacred texts to find meaning and enact justice because they do have social power and authority. The name Israel actually derives from the name given to Jacob after he wrestled with the angel of God in the book of Genesis 32, 22 to 33. Israel means to wrestle with God and win. The Bible is a literature with the power to transform, but it is only literature, religious literature that was probably not written by God, but conceived and edited by men. And when it is misused, it is quite dangerous. The problem begins if one holds to the inerrancy of the Bible, and one may become quite stunned upon studying its history. If we hold to its inerrancy as the basis of our faith, an in-depth study will quickly reveal that it just could not be inerrant. And then one's faith is on shaky grounds. Another issue is its authenticity. Now, one of the most beloved stories is from the Gospel of John, in which Jesus states, "You must be born again." It's quite popular to see this quote on signs at football games. And modern evangelical Christianity is based on the commitment of granting one's life to Christ, being born again as a necessity for being a Christian, indeed as a necessity to go to heaven. The problem is the story could just have never happened. The story in John 3 is a story where Nicodemus, a Pharisee who along with Joseph of Arimathea defended Jesus' innocence when he was brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin after his arrest, and he's speaking with Jesus. Now there was a Pharisee, the story says, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi, we think that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." And Jesus replied, "Verily, truly, I say to you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." Nicodemus asked, "Well, how can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter into their mother's womb to be born." And Jesus answered, "Very truly, I say, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and of spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit." It's a beautiful story, but the problem with the story is that it just could never have happened. The Greek word used for again is anothen, which means again, or can also mean anew. And this double meaning in Greek is not apparent in the Aramaic, the language that Jesus and his contemporaries spoke. So it's just not possible that that conversation could have happened in Aramaic. It is not possible that the conversation happened at all. The dialogue ends with the quote, another big football game quote, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." Well, one question we can ask in a lot of these stories is, who is there to record the conversation? There's no third party unless Jesus told his disciples. And this is a general problem that we have with the New Testament and with religious works. It's the nature of religious literature. It is created as a comment after the event. It imparts a wisdom that is not factual, but meaningful on a deeper level. When one starts to weaponize these stories and versus fact, they are doing so on no solid footing. Another story from the New Testament is the woman caught in adultery, also from the Gospel of John. It's an extraordinary account that is at the heart of Jesus' teachings. John 8:7 reads, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." In the story, Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees. Early in the morning, he went back to the temple courts. As the people came to him and he sat down to teach them, the scribes and Pharisees, however, brought him a woman caught in adultery. And they made her stand before him and said, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" So the gospel contends that they said this to test him in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and began to write on the ground with his finger. When they continued to question him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." And again he bent down on the ground and wrote. When they heard this, they began to go away one by one, beginning with the older ones until only Jesus was left, and the woman standing there with him. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she answered. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Now go and sin no more." This story is very profound, but it's not in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. The 13th century codex, which is quite late in the Christian history, called the Minuscule 759, does not contain it. So how do we use the Bible as a means of liberation rather than as a means of oppression that has been at the heart of its history? One way is uncovering the marginalized voices of the Bible. And I think that that is where its strength and curiosity lies. One of the most important figures in the Bible is the woman Tamar. Are people aware of who the woman Tamar is? Well, actually, the woman Tamar is probably the most important person in the Bible. She's mentioned briefly in Genesis 38 as the wife of Judah's sons. Judah is the oldest son of Jacob, born of a maidservant of his wife Rachel. Rachel was the love of Jacob's life, but did not give him an heir. And after fathering 10 sons with her maidservants, she finally birthed Joseph, whose brothers sold him into slavery because he was Jacob's favorite. Now, one could imagine that after Rachel was barren for so many years, Joseph's birth was quite a miracle. And in the previous chapter, it follows a story where Judah had actually saved Joseph's life, for his brothers wanted to kill him for jealousy of his father's favoritism. Judah suggests that they throw him in a hole, and then when a caravan of Egyptians passes, he suggests selling Joseph to them. Now, in the next chapter, Judah leaves Canaan. He marries a Canaanite woman, Shua, and has 3 sons. Tamar is a Canaanite woman who marries his firstborn heir, who the text says did evil in God's eyes, so he was put to death. In accordance with the law, Tamar marries Er's brother, Onan, who befalls the same fate for the same reason. Now, Judah does not want to marry Tamar to his remaining son, Shelah, who is yet a boy, so he sends her back to her father to live as a widow. This was a man who sold his brother into slavery and then had 2 sons who were shady characters, but he blames Tamar for his misfortunes. Judah's wife, Shua, dies. And as the story progresses, Tamar disguises herself to entice Judah as to get him back, kind of, since he did not marry her to Shelah. And she accomplishes, and she has 2 twins by him. So why is this chapter hidden in the middle of the Joseph story important? Andrew Lloyd Webber did not write a musical called Tamar and Her Amazing Act of Deception, although someone should. One of the twins of Tamar and Judah is named Perez. Perez and Tamar are named in the lineage of King David and thus in the lineage of Jesus. Without this deception of this foreign Canaanite woman, Tamar, who was abandoned by Judah and blamed for the death of her sons, this man who sold his brother into slavery and had 2 corrupt sons and scapegoated Tamar for his afflictions. But it is Tamar's son, Perez, who is David's forefather, and as such, Tamar is responsible for the continuation of the royal line of Israel. Without her amazing act of deception, the story is over. There is no David. There is no Jesus. One of David's daughters is named Tamar. So how do we tell the story of the Torah? Is it a story of patriarchs who led the royal line? Or is it a story of this marginalized foreign woman who saved Israel? Now, we know from the story of the patriarchs that they were not always the most ethical of characters. So maybe telling the story as a tale of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Tamar undermines the patriarchy of the story and creates a more interesting way to look at the Torah tale. How do we come to terms with the Bible as an authoritative script if it has these problems? How do we salvage its call to justice, that call in the later prophets, that call that we see in the Gospels of Jesus? It's a call to help the immigrant, it's a call to help the poor, the widow, and the orphan. It's a narrative of God being a God of the oppressed. We do this by centralizing the marginalized of the story. We must begin by seeing the Bible as a living text, as we do, as Unitarian Universalists. We see that this document of the 3 Abrahamic faiths that has grown has changed with the traditions. For Christians and Muslims, the Bible is a sealed text. Revelation of the New Testament seals the life and Jesus with his coming. The Quran seals Muhammad as the last of the Abrahamic prophets, the final revelation. But for us, revelation is not sealed. It is an ongoing struggle for justice. As Unitarian Universalists, we enter into that struggle, as did the great Talmudic rabbis. And it is enter into that living struggle that keeps the Bible relevant as a book of the oppressed and a book of justice. So what does it mean for someone to raise the Bible, especially those who struggle for justice? Black Lives protesters, for whom the Bible may be the source of inspiration for many. What does it mean to raise it after just having gassed those people? For African Americans, the Bible has been a source of oppression, but also a source of liberation. There was a book used to condone their slavery and oppression, but it was a book that liberated them from slavery and inspired their struggle. It is a book of their exodus and a book that is at the heart of Black Lives Matter. God always sides with the oppressed, regardless of who holds the Bible high. God always sides with the marginalized, even when the oppressor holds the Bible high. God always sides with those who struggle, those who work for justice, and those who are poor, disenfranchised, the neglected, the downtrodden, and the hopeless, even when their oppressor holds the Bible high. And if one is going to hold the Bible high, one needs to understand its significance. It's a book of struggle. It's a book of liberation and a book of deliverance for all. Before one holds the Bible up, one needs to know what that struggle means. One needs to be on the side of that struggle. One needs to take up that struggle, and one needs to be working towards liberation. One needs to be struggling for the deliverance that the Bible promises. And until one raises the mantle of justice, one does not raise the Bible. Until one can ring its truth, don't raise the Bible. Until one is an overseer beyond reproach, don't raise the Bible. To raise the Bible is like an axe on the land. And until one raises an axe of righteousness to destroy racism, sexism, homophobia, and oppression, one has no right to raise the Bible.